3 NBA Hall of Famers, 1 primetime broadcast, and sitting right alongside all of them, Caitlin Clark. Not a rumor, not a fantasy booking someone cooked up on social media at 2 in the morning, not a speculative what-if scenario designed to generate engagement. On Sunday, March 29th, Caitlin Clark took her seat on NBC's Basketball Night in America next to Carmelo Anthony, Vince Carter, and Tracy McGrady, and delivered NBA analysis on a national primetime broadcast in front of an audience that extends far beyond anything the WNBA has traditionally reached. Let that land for a second. Carmelo Anthony, 10-time NBA All-Star, one of the 50 greatest scorers in the history of professional basketball, a player who spent 2 decades carving his name into the offensive record books at a level that only a handful of human beings have ever touched. Vince Carter, half man, half amazing, a player whose athleticism so completely redefined what was physically possible above the rim that highlight reels from his prime still circulate on social media 25 years later because nobody has fully replicated what he did. Tracy McGrady, a scorer so gifted, so naturally fluid, so mechanically perfect in his movement that players who study the game still pull up his footage specifically to learn footwork and shot creation. 2-time NBA scoring champion, a player many serious basketball minds consider genuinely underrated even decades after his prime. Those 3 men and Caitlin Clark on the same panel. If you understand what that selection process actually looks like from a network's perspective, you understand immediately that this wasn't a courtesy appearance. It wasn't a promotional stunt designed to generate a quick news cycle and disappear. NBC's producers don't assemble a pregame panel by accident. They make deliberate, calculated decisions about who belongs in that conversation. And those decisions are driven by one thing above everything else: who delivers credibility and ratings simultaneously to an audience that is paying close attention to every word being said. They chose Clark. And while that story alone would have been more than enough to fill an entire week's worth of legitimate basketball conversation, this particular week handed us 2 major developments for the price of 1. Because at the exact same moment Clark was preparing for her NBC debut, the Indiana Fever's front office was quietly working through a roster calculation that has their entire fan base on edge. A calculation that directly affects the player that fan base adopted as Clark's enforcer, her protector, the player who stepped into situations that nobody else was willing to enter and refused to let the league's most important player absorb punishment without consequences. Sophie Cunningham, the blonde bomber, and a decision that is about to break a lot of Indiana hearts. We're going to break down both stories completely, the NBC takeover and the expansion draft math that most channels either genuinely don't understand or have chosen not to explain honestly, because honest explanation doesn't generate the kind of emotional reaction that drives clicks. Stick with this, because the real story on both fronts is significantly more interesting than anything the fake headline channels have been pushing. Before we get into what actually happened, the fabrication needs to be addressed directly because it has been circulating widely enough that a portion of Indiana's fan base genuinely encountered it and experienced real anxiety as a result. The claim that Caitlin Clark officially confirmed she is leaving the Indiana Fever is false. There is no statement, there is no press conference, there is no credible reporting from any legitimate sports journalism outlet supporting that narrative in any form. It does not exist. What exists is a manufactured headline attached to imagery designed to trigger an emotional response in people who care about this team, crafted with the specific intention of exploiting that emotional investment for engagement and advertising revenue. Here's how that formula works, because once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it, and it becomes significantly easier to protect your own time and energy from content that fundamentally does not respect either. A creator identifies a subject with a passionate, emotionally invested fan base. They find or generate imagery that looks alarming out of context. A player crying, a player looking distressed, a player in a moment that could be interpreted as significant if you don't know what actually caused it.
They attach text to that image that makes the most inflammatory possible claim about that subject. They push it onto platforms where the thumbnail and the title are what users see first before any content is actually consumed. The fanbase's emotional investment does the rest. Clicks pour in, engagement spikes, the algorithm rewards the behavior. The creator does it again. That is the entire operation. There is no journalism happening, there is no research happening, there is no accountability happening because the platforms that host this content have not historically penalized it in any meaningful way. What you can do individually is recognize the pattern and refuse to feed it. The tell is almost always in the specificity of the claim, combined with the complete absence of any named source, any linked reporting, any verifiable quote from any person connected to the situation.
Legitimate reporting on whether a player is leaving a franchise looks very different. It involves named reporters with track records of accuracy. It involves sourcing that can be traced and challenged. It involves the kind of accountability that comes from having a professional reputation staked to the accuracy of what you publish. When a channel that has no reputation and no accountability makes a sensational claim about one of the most followed athletes in the sport, the correct response is not anxiety. The correct response is recognition. Caitlin Clark is not leaving the Indiana Fever. What she is doing is something considerably more significant and considerably more worth your attention, and we are going to get into exactly what that looks like right now. The details of what happened on March 29th matter because they reveal the specific calculation NBC made and why that calculation carries implications that extend well beyond a single pregame appearance. Basketball Night in America is NBC's flagship primetime NBA broadcast. It is not a filler property. It is not a secondary platform they maintain for overflow content on slow weekends. It is the premium product, the broadcast they built around their $2.5 billion investment in NBA rights, the show that sits at the top of their basketball programming hierarchy and commands the production resources, the talent budget, and the promotional machinery that reflects that position. When NBC decides who appears on that broadcast, they are making a statement about who they consider capable of holding their audience's attention alongside the best analytical voices in the sport. Host Maria Taylor, Carmelo Anthony, Vince Carter, Tracy McGrady, and Caitlin Clark. The game itself was the New York Knicks against the Oklahoma City Thunder. If you follow the NBA this season with any regularity, you understand immediately what that matchup represents. This was not a midweek contest between two teams playing out the string in March with nothing meaningful at stake. The Oklahoma City Thunder are one of the most compelling stories in the league this year, built around Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who is not simply a good player, he is currently operating as one of the 2 or 3 most complete offensive players in professional basketball and a genuine candidate to win the Most Valuable Player award. The Knicks are a franchise with one of the largest and most vocal fan bases in the sport, playing meaningful games in a building that creates an atmosphere unlike almost anywhere else in the league. NBC didn't assign Clark to a soft matchup. They didn't find her a comfortable landing spot where the stakes were low and the analytical bar was minimal. They put her on a premium game with legitimate playoff implications, sitting beside 3 men who collectively own multiple scoring titles, championship appearances, and all-star selections measured in the dozens, and trusted her to hold that position credibly. The fact that she did is important, but the fact that NBC believed she would before she ever sat down is arguably more important. That belief didn't come from sentiment. It didn't come from a desire to generate a news story about putting a WNBA player on an NBA broadcast. It came from data. NBC's research teams track audience behavior across every property they own. They know who drives viewership. They know which names generate tune-in from demographics that don't typically engage with certain programming. They know where their investment in Clark's presence across basketball content produces returns that justify the decision. And NBC made a $2.5 billion investment in WNBA broadcasting rights. That number is not written by accident.
Networks at that level of the media industry do not commit that kind of capital to a property unless the people controlling the budget have built a model that justifies it. That model almost certainly includes assumptions about cross-platform value, the idea that Clark's presence doesn't just make WNBA broadcasts more valuable, but makes all of NBC's basketball programming more valuable, because she represents a bridge between audiences that previously didn't overlap in significant numbers. The Basketball Night in America appearance on March 29th is the activation of that belief in its most visible form. It is NBC saying publicly, with real resources committed and real primetime minutes allocated, that Caitlin Clark belongs in the analytical conversation at the highest level of the sport, not as a novelty, not as a promotional exercise, but as a contributor whose voice adds something to a broadcast that Carmelo Anthony, Vince Carter, and Tracy McGrady cannot fully replicate on their own.
That is a significant statement, and it is the real story of what happened this week. To understand why NBC made the decision they made, you need to understand what Caitlin Clark's presence in professional basketball actually did to audience composition over the past 2 seasons, because the numbers tell a story that goes well beyond what casual observers recognize. When Clark entered the WNBA, the league had an existing and genuinely dedicated fan base. But that fan base had a relatively defined demographic profile and a relatively stable ceiling in terms of how many people were paying attention on any given night. What Clark did was not simply add viewers to an existing audience. She created new categories of viewer entirely. Casual sports fans, people who follow major professional leagues with general interest but had never specifically sought out a WNBA game, suddenly had a reason to tune in. Not because they were told to, not because a marketing campaign instructed them to care, because the organic conversation around her games reached a volume and intensity that made ignoring her genuinely difficult if you were someone who paid attention to sports at all. Those fans watched games they would not have watched otherwise. They attended arena events in cities they'd never considered attending WNBA games in before. They bought merchandise connected to a league they had previously engaged with minimally or not at all. College basketball's crossover audience moved with her from Iowa into the professional league at a scale that surprised even optimistic projections. The audience that had watched her rewrite the NCAA scoring record book, that had followed the drama of tournament runs and record-breaking individual performances at the collegiate level, did not dissolve when she turned professional. It migrated, and it brought with it an emotional investment that translated into consistent viewership at the professional level in ways that roster transitions don't typically produce. Perhaps most significantly, she generated a category of younger viewer who found professional basketball specifically through her, not through the NBA, not through traditional basketball media pathways, through Clark directly, as a cultural figure whose appeal transcended the sport and reached audiences that professional basketball had historically struggled to penetrate in any meaningful way. NBC absorbed all of that data and made a strategic calculation that goes beyond any individual broadcast. They are building Clark as a recognizable analytical voice across basketball in general, not confined to WNBA broadcasts, not limited to women's basketball content, but positioned as a figure who can speak credibly about the sport at its highest level and carry audiences across different programming contexts. The contrast with what her own head coach was doing during the same period crystallizes something important about the scale of what's happening. Stephanie White, Indiana's head coach, was doing NCAA women's basketball commentary during the offseason stretch that included Clark's NBC appearance. That is entirely normal. Coaches across professional sports do broadcast work during their off-seasons. There is nothing unusual or critical about White's choice. But the parallel picture, Clark on NBA primetime with Hall of Famers while her coach worked college games, illustrates just how far outside the traditional boundaries of where a WNBA player's profile operates Clark's brand has actually traveled. The March 29th appearance is not the conclusion of this trajectory. It is an early chapter.
the infrastructure NBC is building around their basketball properties, the investment they've made in WNBA rights, and the deliberate choice to place Clark in analytical roles alongside the sport's most credentialed voices all point toward a long-term strategy that is still revealing itself. What we saw on March 29th is the opening move of something that is going to look considerably larger in retrospect than it does even now. Now let's get into the story that is generating the most anxiety among Indiana's fan base, and it has nothing to do with anything Clark is doing. It involves a decision being made around her, about a player who defined herself by protecting her. On March 25th, the WNBA officially revealed the expansion draft rules governing the Toronto Tempo and the Portland Fire, the two newest franchises entering the league. These are not minor procedural details buried in league documents. They are the framework that determines which players from every existing roster are available for the new franchises to select, and which players their current teams get to keep. And for Indiana Fever fans specifically, those rules create a scenario that is going to be uncomfortable regardless of how it ultimately resolves. Here is the foundational mechanic. Every existing WNBA team gets to protect exactly 5 players from their current roster. Those 5 players cannot be selected by Toronto or Portland under any circumstances. Every other player on the roster is available, exposed to potentially being taken by one of the new franchises as they build their inaugural rosters from scratch. 5 spots. That is the entire budget for protection. There are no exceptions, no special circumstances, no mechanism for adding a 6th player, regardless of how much a fan base might want one.
For Indiana, 4 of those 5 spots are decisions that essentially make themselves. Caitlin Clark is protected. That is not a debate. She is the most valuable player in the WNBA, the central piece around which the entire franchise is being constructed, and leaving her exposed would represent a level of front office incompetence so profound it would be genuinely difficult to explain. Aaliyah Boston is protected, one of the most skilled and versatile frontcourt players in the league, a player who complements Clark's offensive game with defensive presence and post skills that the system requires. Kelsey Mitchell is protected, one of the most dynamic guards in the WNBA, a player with scoring ability that gives Indiana a secondary option when defenses are built specifically to contain Clark. Lexi Hall is protected. Her specific situation involves contract mechanics that we'll get into shortly, but her protection is not a matter of serious debate among anyone who understands how the rules work. 4 spots, 4 automatic decisions, and then there is the 5th spot. The entire debate, every anxious comment, every social media argument, every piece of content about Indiana's off-season situation collapses into a single question. Who gets that 5th protection spot? And the answer to that question involves a choice between 2 players whose situations could not be more structurally different from each other, even though the emotional weight assigned to one of them by Indiana's fan base is enormous. Sophie Cunningham or Michaela Timpson. If you watched the Indiana Fever last season with any genuine investment, you don't need an introduction to Sophie Cunningham. But the way she earned her place in this story deserves to be told completely, because understanding what she meant to Indiana's fan base is essential to understanding why the front office's decision feels like such a gut punch to the people who claimed her. Sophie Cunningham is a shooting guard who came into the 2024 season as a professional with years of experience and a clearly defined skill set. A reliable three-point stroke, physical toughness on the defensive end, and a willingness to embrace the specific kind of role that role players often resist because it generates attention in ways that aren't always flattering. She was not arriving as a star. She was not arriving as someone building toward a max contract or positioning herself for an all-star selection. She was arriving to do the work that makes other players better, and to do it without requiring significant credit for doing it. What nobody fully anticipated was the specific way she would respond when the Indiana Fever entered the playoff series against the Connecticut Sun. The Connecticut Sun's approach to Caitlin Clark in that series crossed a line that basketball observers and fans noticed in real time.
The physicality was deliberate in a way that went beyond normal playoff intensity. Contact that would have been whistled in regular season settings was allowed to accumulate. Clark was being targeted specifically because disrupting her physical comfort was the most effective strategy available to a team that could not match her when she was operating freely. That is not speculation. It was visible in the footage, discussed by analysts who cover the game seriously and acknowledged in various forms by people connected to the sport. Sophie Cunningham watched it happen, and then she stopped watching. She stepped into situations that most players in her position would have navigated more carefully. She absorbed contact. She put herself physically between Clark and the punishment that was coming. She got in faces, drew technical fouls, did the things that bring consequences for the player doing them, but send unmistakable messages about what a team is and is not willing to accept. She refused to allow the league's most important player to absorb punishment without every person in that building understanding that doing so came with a cost. Indiana's fan base saw it, and they claimed her immediately. The blonde bomber wasn't a role player after that series in the way the term is typically understood. She was a symbol, a representation of something Indiana wanted to be as a collective, a team that fights for its own, that doesn't back down from physical confrontation, that has the personality and the backbone to match whatever intensity an opponent decides to bring. In a league where Clark's profile makes her a target in ways that are sometimes uncomfortably visible, having a player who responds to that targeting with Sophie Cunningham's specific brand of willingness became deeply emotionally meaningful to the people who watch this team every night. And now, she might not be in Indiana blue next season.
Here is where the conversation shifts from emotional narrative to contractual mechanics, and where most coverage of this situation has either missed the key detail or chosen not to explain it, because nuance is harder to package than outrage. Sophie Cunningham is 29 years old. She is an unrestricted free agent heading into this offseason. Those two facts exist inside a specific expansion draft rule that completely transforms the calculation about whether protecting her with Indiana's 5th spot makes any practical sense whatsoever. Toronto and Portland are not each allowed one unrestricted free agent selection. They are collectively allowed one unrestricted free agent selection across the entire draft combined. Read that again, because the implication is significant. Two brand new franchises building their inaugural rosters from scratch, trying to assemble competitive teams from the ground up, and between the two of them, they get one total unrestricted free agent pick from a pool of over 100 veteran unrestricted free agents entering the expansion draft pool. 100+ players competing for a single selection slot shared between two organizations. Think about the mathematics of that for a moment. Over 100 unrestricted free agents, ranging in age, skill level, positional profile, contract history, and developmental trajectory. Two teams with one collective pick to deploy across the entire pool. The probability that either Toronto or Portland spends their single combined unrestricted free agent selection on Sophie Cunningham, a 29-year-old role player, however valued and however proven, is genuinely and analytically low. Expansion teams don't build rosters through sentiment. They build rosters through the kind of cold-blooded evaluation that considers every variable simultaneously. Age curves, contract value, positional need, long-term developmental ceiling, franchise identity construction. They are looking for one of two things: young players with legitimate developmental upside locked into affordable deals that allow the organization to grow around them over multiple seasons, or established stars with enough remaining prime years and enough profile to anchor a franchise identity from day one. Sophie Cunningham, at 29, as an unrestricted free agent, fits neither profile in the context of an expansion team assembling its first-ever roster. Mikayla Timpson is an entirely different equation, and this is the comparison that makes Indiana's decision almost inevitable when you walk through it honestly. Timpson is still under contract with the Indiana Fever.
She is a young player with legitimate developmental upside who demonstrated real potential during the 2025 season as a rookie. Those two facts, under contract, young with upside, represent exactly what expansion teams prioritize in the draft process. Any expansion front office that surveys the available pool and finds a young player on a locked rookie deal with room to grow takes her. Not maybe, not probably, takes her. That is free franchise-building value that doesn't require spending the rare unrestricted free agent pick and can be acquired through the standard draft mechanism that costs significantly less strategic capital. If Indiana leaves Timpson unprotected, she gets selected. There is no uncertainty in that outcome, none. The only way to prevent losing Timpson to Toronto or Portland is to use Indiana's 5th protection spot on her specifically. And using it on Timpson means Sophie Cunningham is exposed. But here is the deeper layer that makes Indiana's decision genuinely defensible even to fans who love what Sophie brought to this team. Even if Indiana dedicates that 5th protection spot to Sophie Cunningham, her situation doesn't fundamentally change. She still enters free agency as an unrestricted player at the conclusion of the process. Protection prevents Toronto and Portland from drafting her during the expansion process. That is the only thing it does. It does not sign her to a new contract with Indiana. It does not give the Fever any matching rights when she negotiates with other teams. It does not create any contractual obligation on Sophie's side, any financial commitment on Indiana's side, or any mechanism that keeps her in Indianapolis beyond the expansion draft itself. She walks off that protected list and directly onto the open market, available to any organization that wants to make an offer, free to sign wherever the terms are most favorable, under zero obligation to choose Indiana over anyone else. If a team with cap space and a genuine need for her specific skill set approaches her with $650,000 or $700,000, Indiana has no tool to match it, no mechanism to intervene, no recourse of any kind. Whether she was on the protected list or not, the outcome in that scenario is identical. Sophie Cunningham leaves. This is where the tension becomes most concrete, and where the gap between what Indiana's fan base wants and what Indiana's financial architecture can actually deliver becomes impossible to paper over with optimism. Indiana's salary cap situation heading into this offseason is compressed in a very specific way that leaves almost no flexibility for the decisions that aren't about their top 3 players. Caitlin Clark's rookie contract is winding towards its conclusion. When she re-signs, and she will re-sign, this is not a question anyone connected to the situation is treating as genuinely uncertain. She commands a supermax deal. That contract will consume a substantial portion of the team's total cap allocation. The exact numbers are still being worked out in the context of the league's overall salary structure, but the directional reality is clear. Caitlin's next deal is going to be the largest in WNBA history, and it is going to cost Indiana a significant share of whatever cap room they have available.
Aaliyah Boston carries a meaningful cap commitment. Kelsey Mitchell carries a meaningful cap commitment. Those two players, combined with Clark's incoming supermax, represent the undeniable core around which Indiana's entire competitive window is constructed. Their contracts take clear and non-negotiable priority in every financial planning conversation the front office has. They are not optional. They are not subject to creative accounting or restructuring in ways that would free up significant space for complementary pieces. What remains after Clark, Boston, and Mitchell are handled is whatever is left, and that remainder has to cover every other roster spot Indiana wants to fill with any quality at all. In that context, the gap between what Sophie Cunningham can realistically command on the open market and what Indiana can realistically offer her without compromising their core becomes the defining number in this entire conversation. Multiple analysts tracking Indiana's cap situation have put their realistic ceiling for a complementary role player at somewhere between $400,000 and $450,000. Sophie's demonstrated skill set, a reliable three-point stroke that creates real spacing, physical defensive commitment that opposing coaches have to account for, playoff experience in high-pressure situations, and the specific toughness that elevated her profile during the Connecticut Sun series could realistically attract offers in the range of $650,000 to $700,000 from a team with genuine cap flexibility and a specific need for what she provides. That gap, potentially $250,000 or more annually, is not a rounding error. For a 29-year-old professional athlete operating in a league where career windows are finite and every contract matters in terms of long-term financial security, $250,000 per year over a 2- or 3-year deal is a life-altering difference. It is not reasonable to expect any professional in Sophie's position to leave that kind of money on the table purely out of loyalty to a franchise that cannot match the market's best offer, regardless of how much she values the relationships she's built in Indianapolis. There is one additional financial mechanism worth understanding here because it further closes the door on Indiana finding a creative path to retain her. The Fever's single core designation this offseason, a tool that allows teams to retain a specific player above the standard cap tier by committing additional resources to one player's deal, is almost certainly committed to Kelsey Mitchell. Mitchell's role as one of the WNBA's most dynamic backcourt players, her value to the offensive system Clark operates within, and her profile as a player who could attract serious interest from other organizations if left without a committed retention effort, all make her the clear and logical candidate for Indiana's core designation. That mechanism, already allocated before Sophie's situation is even formally addressed, removes the one tool Indiana might have used to bridge the gap between their standard cap ceiling and the market rate Sophie is likely to command. The financial pathways are allocated. The core tag is spoken for. The cap math compresses the available space for complementary pieces below the level Sophie's market value projects to reach. Indiana's front office is not making a decision about whether they value Sophie Cunningham. They are operating inside constraints that make retaining her at market rate functionally impossible, regardless of how they feel about her as a player or a person. The Lexi Hall comparison is the clearest way to explain why Indiana's protection decisions aren't arbitrary or emotionally motivated, and why the front office's reasoning holds up analytically even when it produces an outcome that feels wrong to the fans who watched Sophie earn her place. Lexi is a restricted free agent. That designation, 3 words in a contract structure, represents a fundamentally different legal and strategic situation than what Cunningham faces. The distinction is not subtle. It is the entire difference between a team that controls a player's future and a team that can only hope. If any organization offers Hull a contract, whether it's $500,000, $600,000, or any other number, Indiana has the right to match that offer and retain her. The mechanism is clean and absolute. Another team can make the best offer available, Indiana can see that offer, match it dollar for dollar, and Hull stays in Indianapolis. The competing team gets nothing. Their investment in recruiting and negotiating and constructing a competitive offer produces 0 result because Indiana has the final word every single time, no matter what the market does. Indiana never loses Lexi Hall without actively choosing to let her go.
Sophie Cunningham's situation contains no version of that sentence. She is an unrestricted free agent. The moment she signs a contract with another organization, the transaction is complete and Indiana's involvement in her professional future is over. There is no matching right, there is no right of first refusal, there is no mechanism that allows Indiana to intervene at any stage of a negotiation they aren't party to. They can express interest, they can make an offer, they can communicate that they want her back and that they value what she contributed. But if another team's contract is on the table and it's better, Indiana watches her sign it, and that is the end of the story. That is why Hull gets protected despite being a free agent whose situation contains its own uncertainties. Indiana has contractual leverage over her future. They have the ability to retain her against market competition through a defined legal mechanism. Protecting her ensures they don't lose her to the expansion draft, while maintaining their ability to keep her against any free agent offer that follows.
Cunningham's protection accomplishes only one specific thing. It prevents the expansion draft from taking her. It does not give Indiana any additional leverage over what happens next. It does not change the unrestricted nature of her free agency once the expansion process concludes. It does not create any tools that Indiana doesn't already have for retaining an unrestricted free agent through ordinary means. The front office is not choosing between valuing Sophie and disrespecting her. They are choosing between spending a protection spot that changes nothing about their ability to retain her, or spending it on a player they would unquestionably lose the moment she was exposed. That is not a cold-blooded dismissal of everything she contributed. It is a recognition that the contract structure makes the two situations genuinely incomparable, and that using limited resources on protection that produces no meaningful change in outcomes is a luxury Indiana cannot afford. Fever fans deserve to understand exactly what they are facing, and that means walking through both realistic outcomes completely. The version that ends well for Sophie and Indiana, and the version that doesn't. The optimistic scenario plays out like this. Indiana makes the decision to leave Sophie Cunningham unprotected, protecting Timpson with that fifth spot instead. Toronto and Portland receive the list. Their front offices survey the pool of over 100 unrestricted free agents and run their own version of the same analysis laid out here. Age curve, contract value, positional need, long-term franchise value. They determine that neither organization wants to burn their single combined unrestricted free agent selection on a 29-year-old role player when the pool contains younger, cheaper options with longer developmental windows. They pass on Sophie entirely. Sophie Cunningham enters regular free agency. Indiana approaches her first and puts their best realistic offer on the table, somewhere in the $400,000 to $450,000 range. Sophie sits with that number and thinks about what it means to play alongside Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston, and Kelsey Mitchell on a franchise that is positioned to compete for a championship in the near term. She thinks about what it means to be part of a team with the kind of visibility and media attention that comes with Clark's presence, in a city where the fan base has embraced her in a way that doesn't happen everywhere in this league. She decides that the competitive environment and the personal relationships and the specific opportunity Indiana represents is worth accepting something below her maximum market value. She signs. The front office looks ahead of the situation. Fever fans exhale. The blonde bomber stays in Indianapolis. That outcome is plausible. It is not guaranteed, but it is genuinely within the range of how this resolves if the expansion teams make the decisions that the contractual mathematics most strongly suggest. The pessimistic scenario runs in exactly the opposite direction. A rebuilding organization, possibly one of the new expansion teams in free agency, possibly an established franchise that has cleared cap space and identified Sophie's profile as specifically valuable to what they're trying to build, decides that her toughness, her three-point shooting, and her playoff credibility represent exactly what they need. They come to the table with $650,000 or $700,000, and the kind of contract security that a player in Sophie's position, at 29, with her professional windows becoming finite, simply cannot walk away from. At that number, Indiana's financial architecture makes matching impossible. Clark, Boston, and Mitchell have consumed the available cap. There is nothing left to compete at that salary tier for a complementary role player, regardless of how much the front office values what she brought to the team. Sophie takes the money, she leaves Indianapolis, and Fever fans spend the offseason frustrated that the player who stepped up when it mattered most is wearing someone else's colors. Here is the analytical layer that makes even the pessimistic scenario less catastrophic than it appears in the immediate emotional aftermath. If a team was genuinely willing to pay Sophie Cunningham $700,000 in free agency, they were never going to waste their single expansion draft selection on her in the first place. An expansion team that has identified Sophie as worth $700,000 on a free agent contract
saves their single unrestricted pick for a player they couldn't get in free agency, and waits to sign Sophie through ordinary channels. The expansion draft pick has strategic value precisely because it can force a team to surrender a player they actually want to keep. Sophie's unrestricted status means Indiana cannot keep her against a superior financial offer, regardless of what any protected list says.
In the scenario where Sophie gets rich in free agency, protecting her would have been protecting her from an outcome that was never actually coming through the draft, and spending Indiana's fifth protection spot to prevent a draft selection that was never going to happen would have meant losing Timpson to an expansion pick that was absolutely going to happen. Sophie Cunningham's situation is painful for Indiana's fanbase specifically, but it is not unique to Indiana, and understanding why it keeps happening across the league is important context for anyone who is going to follow this sport seriously over the next several years. The WNBA is growing faster than it has at any point in its history. The revenue numbers tell that story clearly. Broadcast deals, attendance records, merchandise, sponsorships, all of it trending in a direction that reflects genuine mainstream recognition of the league as a viable, valuable sports property. NBC's $2.5 billion commitment, the expansion into Toronto and Portland, the conversation that has moved from whether the WNBA can survive to what shape its future growth takes. These are markers of an organization in a genuinely different place than it was even 5 years ago. The compensation framework has not kept pace. The salary cap that governs how teams build rosters reflects a financial structure that was negotiated when the league's baseline revenue looked very different from where it stands today. Teams that are generating record revenues, playing in front of larger crowds than ever, appearing on national primetime broadcasts alongside Hall of Famers, those teams are still operating under cap constraints that force zero-sum decisions on a regular basis. Even the best-run franchises, with the deepest fan bases and the most marketable rosters and the clearest organizational vision, are constantly releasing players who contributed meaningfully to their competitive success because the arithmetic simply does not accommodate everyone. There is no roster management genius that makes the Indiana Fever's cap situation generous enough to retain everyone who deserves to be retained. There is no version of this that doesn't require releasing valued contributors. The math forces it, regardless of organizational intent. Sophie Cunningham's situation is a league-wide symptom presenting itself on the most visible roster in the sport. The same decision with the same painful emotional weight for local fan bases is playing out in different forms across every team going through expansion draft preparations. Indiana happens to be where the whole world is watching, which amplifies the visibility of a dynamic that is quietly devastating fan bases in cities that don't have Clark driving national media attention to every roster. The CBA negotiations now approaching are the mechanism through which this tension either resolves or calcifies. Players have been vocal about the gap, the specific, documented, undeniable gap between the revenue growth that Clark's arrival and NBC's broadcast investment have driven and the salaries available to the vast majority of roster contributors who make that product worth watching. The players doing the work that makes Caitlin Clark's record-breaking performances possible, the defenders who set screens, the role players who knock down open threes, the physical contributors who absorb contact so the stars can operate freely, are negotiating contracts in a compensation framework that hasn't kept pace with what their labor is generating. If the next CBA produces meaningful cap increases, teams gain the flexibility to retain players like Sophie without being forced into zero-sum choices between people they value. The decision Indiana is currently making, painful, defensible, structurally inevitable, potentially becomes less common because the financial architecture gives front offices real options instead of constrained ones. If negotiations stall, if the gap between what players want and what the league is prepared to offer proves too wide to bridge in the near term, this same dynamic repeats. Every expansion cycle, every free agency period.
The most beloved contributors on every roster become casualties of mathematics that no individual front office has the power to override. The fan base frustration accumulates, the players' sense of professional instability compounds, and the league continues growing its revenue while the people generating that revenue negotiate from a structural disadvantage.
That is the actual story underneath the Sophie Cunningham situation. Not Indiana's indifference to a fan favorite, not a front office that lost track of what she meant to the people watching. The real story is a compensation structure that forces impossible choices onto the teams with the most visibility. In a league that is experiencing growth, it hasn't built the infrastructure to share equitably with the players making it possible. Caitlin Clark is sitting at a table with Hall of Famers preparing NBA analysis for a national primetime broadcast. The expansion draft clock is ticking. Sophie Cunningham's name will not appear on Indiana's protected list when that list is finalized, and the conversation that follows that announcement will generate exactly the kind of reaction that doesn't fully account for the contract mechanics and market probability that make the decision analytically defensible even as it produces genuine emotional pain. Two specific developments will tell you more about where this entire situation resolves than any protected list announcement or social media argument ever could. The first is whether either Toronto or Portland makes any public-facing moves in the weeks approaching the expansion draft that suggest they are prioritizing unrestricted veteran talent in their selection strategy. If either franchise signals that their single, combined, unrestricted free agent pick is going toward a player who matches Sophie's profile, veteran, proven, physical, reliably productive in a complementary role, that materially shifts the probability that Sophie enters this process genuinely at risk of being selected, rather than simply passing through the draft pool into regular free agency. Watch how those organizations talk about their roster-building philosophy and who they identify publicly as their target player profile. The language front offices use in the period leading up to a draft is almost always directionally accurate, even when it isn't specific. The second is whether any reporting surfaces about Sophie's camp and Indiana's front office having early off-season conversations. In professional basketball, the timing and tone of these pre-free agency discussions carry significant information. When a player and a team are genuinely working toward mutual resolution, conversations happen early and quietly. When the gap is too wide to bridge and both sides know it, those conversations either don't happen or happen late in the process as formalities. If reporting emerges that Sophie and Indiana have been in active communication with specifics being discussed, the optimistic scenario becomes meaningfully more likely. If the silence continues deep into the offseason, the pessimistic scenario gains probability. Both signals will tell you where this ends before the official announcement arrives. What this week ultimately demonstrated, across both the NBC story and the expansion draft situation, is the specific tension that defines this moment in the WNBA's development. The league is generating real mainstream visibility at a level that produces situations like Caitlin Clark sitting alongside Carmelo Anthony on national primetime television. It is simultaneously operating under a financial structure that forces teams to make the kind of ruthless roster decisions that break fan bases' hearts on a regular basis. Those two realities exist simultaneously in the same organization, in the same offseason, playing out on the most watched roster in the sport. The expansion draft is coming fast. The Sophie Cunningham situation will resolve in one direction or the other, and the fan base's reaction to that resolution will be significant regardless of the outcome. The NBA primetime appearances are not stopping. Clark's profile is expanding into spaces WNBA players have historically never occupied, and NBC's investment ensures that expansion continues with real resources behind it. Watch the front office signals. Watch the expansion team communications. Watch whether Sophie's camp and Indiana find enough common ground to make the discount worth accepting. And when the protected list drops and the selection results come in, read them with the contract mechanics in mind rather than the emotional narrative.
because the math, as painful as it is, tells the complete story in a way that the emotional reaction simply cannot. This community has been ahead of this story from the beginning. The conversation is just getting started.